reach heaven's joys, O bright and sun. Heart of my heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
Hello and welcome back to our study of the book of Acts. I think you'll remember that the last time we were together we were talking about Paul in the city of Jerusalem, and in particular we were talking about the defense that he had to make on that occasion. In chapter 21 he had been violently taken by a mob. They were about to beat him to death, but the Roman commander intervened and kept that from happening. When the commander started to take Paul up and have him and try to find out what the problem was, Paul indicated that he wanted to speak to him, and the commander was a bit surprised that Paul was able to speak Greek. But in point of fact, Paul did speak Greek to him, asked for permission to talk to the angry mob. He gave that permission. And so Paul, in the Hebrew tongue, spoke to the angry mob, related really everything involved in his conversion. And that really went pretty well. It was only when Paul began to tell how that the Lord had told him to get out of Jerusalem because they're not going to accept what you had to say. It was only then when he explained that the Lord said, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles, that the mob virtually erupted again. Great violence was intended against him. And so the commander had Paul bound and carried toward the barracks where he was going to scourge him to find out what in the world is going on. But Paul intervened in a certain sense of the word, and you might well say God intervened, and he asked, are you going to beat a man who is a Roman citizen uncondemned? And the commander, the centurion, passed the word to the commander, do you know what you're doing? You know, we're about to be in some real trouble. Well, the commander came back. He discovered that Paul, in fact, was a Roman citizen, and so he had him set loose from his bonds. And the next day, he commanded the council to come and let Paul appear before them so that the commander can discover what the real problem is. So Acts chapter 23 opens with Paul standing before the council and beginning to give what might be described as his second defense. Listen to him. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Now I realize that the Jews are going to see this as in a totally different light, but for a moment I want us to think about ourselves. And I want all of us to realize about ourselves that we can live never violating our consciences and yet be living in sin. Paul persecuted the church. That wasn't what the Lord really wanted. But he did persecute the church, and he did it in all good conscience. So whenever we talk about ourselves, when I talk to you or you talk to me about problems that we may see or inconsistencies in regard to our following the will of God, let's all agree to this one thing. That doesn't mean that I'm saying you're insincere. It doesn't mean you're saying I'm insincere. It doesn't mean that you think I've violated my conscience. It simply means that it's possible to do something wrong even while thinking that it's all right. And that's what Paul has just said. I've lived in all good conscience. But in verse 2 of Acts 23, listen to the response of the Jews. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Now, it's difficult for us in the English language, and particularly not being for the most part Jews in our background, it's difficult for us to understand everything that's going on here. When Paul says, "Did you not know?" The word that he uses there means to acknowledge, to have regard for, according to Thayer. And so when Wayne Jackson looked at that in his little commentary, he said that the sense here would be this: I do not recognize him as high priest. He certainly doesn't act like one. And boy, that was the truth. And Paul demonstrated it very well. The high priest should have been the defender of the law. He should have been the one that abided by the law and encouraged everyone else to do the same. When he commanded Paul to be struck, he actually was commanding an action that was against the law of Moses. So, Paul didn't recognize him as high priest because he didn't act like one at the minimum, and maybe for other reasons as well, but certainly for that reason. Now, verse 4 continues. And those who stood by said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" Then Paul said, "I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." All right, now we've seen it. He didn't know he was high priest, and so that's why he said it. He didn't recognize him. He didn't behave like one. But Paul knows the law, and here comes a significant little factor that all of us need to take into account. I may not respect what an agent of the law does, but I need to respect him because he's an agent of the law. He may not act like he is enforcing the law, but I need to respect the law and abide by it. Why? Because I am a child of the King. I'm a child of Jesus. And as such, I need to demonstrate a respect for the authority that Jesus has given to those who are in governmental service. Paul knew that, and he says, I wouldn't have done it had I realized who this was. But then verse 6, but when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out. And what did he say? Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. Well, boy, Paul is a wise man. He understands that this council is divided, maybe not equally, but certainly divided. On the one hand, you have the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. In fact, they didn't even believe in the spirit world. And so they would have been totally opposed to the resurrection. On the other hand, we have the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, as an old sage once said, were fair, you see, because they did believe in the resurrection from the dead. But the Sadducees are sad, you see, because they do not believe in the resurrection from the dead. Well, Paul sees those divergent views represented in this group. He knows them that well. Maybe he was one of them. And so he says, I'm being judged today because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead. Because I am a Pharisee, they're judging me. Now, you can almost imagine the response that such a statement is going to get. In verse 7 of Acts chapter 23, Luke reports, and when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The word that is here translated dissension means to stand up in strife. So you can almost imagine all these men standing up and the Sadducees pointing fingers at the Pharisees and saying, you are wrong about the resurrection. And the Pharisees saying, no, you're wrong about the resurrection. Paul has stirred up the crowd and they are reacting. And Luke explains why. For Sadducees say there's no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Paul has gotten the exact desired result. He wants the Pharisees to take time to examine the position that he is occupying, a position that believes with all of his heart in the resurrection from the dead. Now, that position extends beyond where the Pharisees at this moment are ready to go. If you go back again to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul gives a list of all the people who saw Jesus raised from the dead. You'll remember that it includes more than 500 brethren at one time. It includes all the apostles, and it includes, of course, Paul himself. He describes himself as being one like one born out of due time. In other words, he didn't see Jesus when the others did. It was much later. But he did see Jesus. And that seeing of Jesus made a tremendous impact on his life. In fact, he believed in the resurrection of Jesus, and having believed in the resurrection of Jesus, he preached the gospel. And that's what he's getting ready to tell the Pharisees, if they'll allow it. He's going to tell them that the door of opportunity is swung open. Who then would be prime candidates among the Jews to obey the gospel? My answer would be the prime candidates would be the Pharisees. The Sadducees, on the other hand, are probably far removed at this moment from believing. It's going to take a lot more to convince them. And so Luke continues, verse 10. "And when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks." Well, they continued to stand up. They continued to argue with each other. And the commander, looking at the situation, thinks, uh-oh, they're going to pull Paul apart. And I'm going to have to answer because a Roman citizen in my care was destroyed by this angry group. So he directs that Paul be taken back to the barracks, but he's still got a problem. The problem is he doesn't know what the charges are. And what's he going to say to the one over him? That's going to be the big question. So let's look at verse 11. "But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome.'" It is interesting to note here that Jesus uses what could be described as the divine imperative here. You must also. That is the divine imperative. There is no doubt because God, the Son of God Himself, is going to see to it that you get Rome to deliver up testimony concerning me. He also says, "Be of good cheer." We wouldn't say it that way. We would say, take courage, friend. Take courage. Because not only are you going to survive this, you're going to Rome, and in Rome you're going to testify concerning me. So verse 12, "And when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul." The Jews are determined to bring this thing to the end that they desire. And the desired end is nothing less than the death of the Apostle Paul. But verse 13 gives us an interesting further bit of knowledge. "Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy." The word conspiracy there literally means who had sworn together. They all together swore that they were going to kill Paul before they ate or drank again. They're expecting they're going to be able to pull this off in short order. and they have a plan for how they're going to bring it about. Verse 14, they came to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near. In other words, we've got a devious plan in mind. You high priests, you tell the council that you're going to have Paul come again. And here's what you tell the commander. You want to flesh this thing out. You want to have a discussion with him further about this. You have some questions to ask him. But don't worry about it. He's never going to get into your presence. We're going to kill him before he gets there. That's their plan. So then in verse 16, Luke gives us this report in chapter 23. So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. We'd say Paul's nephew. Paul's sister's son heard about it. How did he hear? I don't know. But I can assert this, I believe it likely is true, that God in His providence made sure that this young man heard the plot that was being formed. It's the only way, really, that God can defend the apostle. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him. Now notice, Paul doesn't tell the centurion anything except take this young man to the commander. So whatever's going to transpire is going to be between just two people, the young man, Paul's nephew, and the commander. And that's exactly what will transpire. Verse 18, so he took him and brought him to the commander and said, Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you. Then the commander took him by the hand and went aside and asked privately, what is it that you have to tell me? So see, only two people are going to know. That is the commander and the young man. Of course, Paul already knows, but nobody else knows the message that this nephew of Paul's is going to deliver to the commander. And so now in verse 20, he speaks up and he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for that promise from you. So now the commander knows. He knows the plot against Paul. He knows that they've sworn together and that they plan to kill him. And so what is the commander going to do with this? Well, first of all, he has words for the young man. Those are found in verse 22. So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, tell no one that you have revealed these things to me. He wanted to keep this just between them. A good commander in any army knows that the element of surprise is vitally important to the success of most military maneuvers, and that certainly would be the case on this occasion. Verse 23 of Acts 23, Luke then reports, and he called for 2 centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. The commander is taking what you and I might well call a preemptive maneuver. His idea is, I'm going to get Paul out of town. I'm going to get him out before they have any opportunity to carry through on their threats. And boy, does he ever make sure that they've got plenty to deal with the situation. 200 men on foot, 200 men or 70 men on horseback, and then 200 spearmen to go along with the soldiers. He's got 270 who are going to lead Paul. I say lead him. Paul's not walking to Caesarea. Instead, they give him a horse at the direction of the commander so that he can ride to Caesarea. And this is a distance of some 60 miles to the west that they are going to travel to get Paul out of harm's way. Now, the problem still exists, and that is the commander doesn't really have anything to tell Felix, the governor, in regard to Paul and why he's sending him. But he writes a letter, and this letter is of great interest. It is political, it seems to me, in nature. It serves the interests of the commander in the best possible way, but of course God uses it to protect Paul, and for that reason we are thankful. Verse 25, and he wrote a letter in the following manner: Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor, Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Now you and I know that this is a little bit spun, if you would. He's not quite telling the whole truth. Instead, he is setting forth the truth with a little bit of embellishment. And every bit of the embellishment is to his advantage, particularly that he says, I went to save him because I learned that he was a Roman. The fact of the matter is, as you know and I know, that he didn't know Paul was a Roman, and he was actually about to beat him in order to find out what the problem was when Paul interjected that he was a Roman. But that's the message he delivers, and he continues. And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council, which of course you and I know he actually did. Then verse 29, I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but I had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. Now I'm going to pause again just a moment to realize this. There's not a single Roman authority who says that Paul is worthy of death. All the way back to the case of this commander, Lysias, in Jerusalem, we know for a fact that Paul has done nothing, they know that he's done nothing, worthy of death. So verse 30, and when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and I also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Well, this letter doesn't tell Felix what the problem is at all, except that he does now know that Paul has stirred up a hornet's nest, so to speak, among the Jews, that the Jews want him to die, but that Lysias finds no reason for death. What are the charges? Well, Lysias says, I've commanded his accusers to come and tell you. Well, that's pretty good. And it's significant and truthful. Truthful in this sense. He hasn't been able to ascertain what the problem is. And so now he leaves it to the governor to find out. So, verse 31, here's how Luke continues. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. So they've made a part of the journey. They've made that journey with 200 foot soldiers, 200 spearmen, and 70 horsemen, men on horseback. And they've journeyed to Antipatris. And it's there that we find the next day they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the barracks. In other words, the 200 foot soldiers, the 200 spearmen all go back to Jerusalem. You know, there might still be trouble there. They don't know. Lysias can't know what the Jews are going to do when they find out that Paul is gone. So the bulk of his forces come back to Jerusalem, and Paul goes forward with just the 70 horsemen. He himself's on horseback, so that's going to work out very well. And they go forward to Caesarea. Verse 33, when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Well, there are several things that we want to observe here. First of all, I want us to look briefly at the record of a historian by the name of Tacitus. Tacitus, in his book called simply Histories, in book 5, verse 9, says this, the epitaph which history has written of this man, that is Felix, is this, with savagery and lust he exercised the powers of a king with the disposition of a slave. Well, boy, that's not a surprise, really, because in reality, Felix was a slave. He had obtained his freedom, and he had risen up through the ranks of political power until finally he was a governor in this area. Felix took his place in 59 A.D., and Paul was with him, Festus took Felix's place in 59 A.D. We know that Paul was with Felix for 2 years. So our conclusion is that sometime in 57 A.D., Paul was taken to Caesarea. And that helps us to date a number of things. For example, the letter to the Corinthians may well have been written while he was in this imprisonment for 2 years in Caesarea. Other letters may also have been written, maybe the prison epistles. We don't really know. But we do have a general idea of time frames because of this incident. Now, he's taken to Herod's praetorium, and that is an interesting place. For 12 years, from somewhere between 23 and 22 BC, Herod the Great had built Caesarea Maritima that is nearly 165 acres in size. He built it on the ruins of a tower that's called Strabos Tower, which we would say is a lighthouse. Josephus says that he built several splendid palaces of white stone, and that's written in his book called simply Wars in book 1, chapter 21 and verse 5. So now Paul is in Caesarea. He's being held in the praetorium. He's going to spend 2 years there, as we'll later learn. But in that time, he will answer his accusers, and then a very, very significant thing will take place that will further the gospel because of the outreach of the prisoner, the Apostle Paul.
May I reach heaven's joys,